Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, and I'm joined by Sue-Lin Wong. Sue-Lin is the Economist's Southeast Asia correspondent. Before that, she was a China correspondent for The Economist and a host of The Prince, a well-regarded, multiple award-winning podcast from The Economist about Xi Jinping. We're going to talk about Xi. We're going to talk about China's role in Southeast Asia, about some of her most recent work under the title Scam Inc., about corruption and geopolitics within the region. So lots to get to. Sue-Lin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
You're in Singapore right now, but let's start with you, as we always do. How did you end up in the place you are today? What got you interested in China and Southeast Asia and journalism and got you on this path?
I was born and raised in Sydney, Australia, where you're based, but I'm of Chinese heritage and grew up going to Saturday school, learning Mandarin. And I remember when I graduated from high school, I decided, you know what, I'd actually like to really get my Chinese to the next level. And so I decided to go to China for a year to teach English. And it was this incredible adventure. I couldn't get a job anywhere. I remember applying for about 50 jobs. No one wanted to employ an 18-year-old who looked Chinese. And so I ended up getting two offers, one in Inner Mongolia and one in Hunan. And I thought, Hunan will be warmer. Little did I know that there's no indoor heating in the south in the winter. But I ended up in rural Hunan and just had a ball. Fell in love with the country and decided I'm going to come back here. I'm going to figure out how I can come back. So I went home to Australia, studied at the Australian National University, ended up going on exchange to China and started freelancing. And in my final year of university, applied for a bunch of journalism jobs and very fortunately got a job with Reuters. So I spent about 4 years with Reuters, then I was with the Financial Times, and then I joined The Economist. And all that reporting was focused on China. But obviously China has changed a lot, which we can get into. A couple of years ago, the Hong Kong government declined to renew my work visa, and so I had to figure out a plan B and ended up here in Singapore covering Southeast Asia, which has been an absolute delight, but obviously a lot to get up to speed with. So that's sort of a potted history of how I've ended up where I am.
So I have to ask a very Sydney question, but where did you go to high school?
I went to Sydney Girls High School. That's an incredibly Sydney question.
That's a great school. My daughter's at St. Catherine's. She's learning Japanese, so we'll see where she goes. And then one more Sydney question. What was your co-curricular? Did you do sports or debate or?
Yeah, I'm very unoriginal for an Economist correspondent. I did, in fact, do debating, and my two teammates from high school debating are still two of my closest friends. One of them gave the speech at my wedding.
Well, I hope it wasn't in ISDA debate format when your friend did it.
Oh, wow. You know all the lingo.
We shouldn't talk too much about Sydney, but believe me, my wife and I have discovered how different parenting is. A lot of time watching debate and water polo and all the rest. Well, great. So many things we could dive into, given your time in China, your experience in Hong Kong. Let's try to stay focused on Southeast Asia, at least for a bit. I'd be interested in how, as a China watcher and expert on Xi Jinping, and now in Singapore looking at Southeast Asia, how would you characterize the evolution of China's approach to Southeast Asia and what you think Xi Jinping's strategy is for Southeast Asia? We are in a period where it's the fist inside the velvet glove. I mean, there's some hard power, there's economics. What do you see as the trajectory of China's approach and Xi Jinping's thinking about Southeast Asia?
What I have witnessed over the past few years is more and more of a presence of China in Southeast Asia. And when I say China, I don't just mean the Chinese Communist Party. I also mean private Chinese business, small businesses, a growing Chinese diaspora from the mainland. Obviously, there's been diasporas here for many, many generations who, have nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Party or were fleeing the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's very much a trend, especially now with the new Trump administration. I think there's a feeling that China's showing up and China's here. And so China's the option that countries have got, even if they would really ideally prefer a very robust US presence here. I think given the broader climate, the trend is that we're seeing more and more of a presence of China. And as you say, there is a lot of hard power. I covered the South China Sea, and you can see China, slowly but steadily using its salami slicing tactics to try to take more and more control of the South China Sea. But then you've also just got these fascinating small private firms from inside China that decided, there wasn't that much growth domestically anymore and they wanted to go global. And Southeast Asia was a great testing ground. So I know you just came back from Indonesia. Everywhere I go in the region, I see Mi Xue, which is this milk tea and ice cream shop. And I think it's now the 5th largest food and beverage chain in the world, behind McDonald's, Starbucks, KFC, and Subway. And yet we almost never see it in the West, but it's all over Southeast Asia. And that's a Chinese chain from Henan province that is going global, and Southeast Asia is very much where it sees its sort of launch pad to be. And that's replicated across, English tutoring companies from China that felt the market there was oversaturated, office chair firms, all kinds of really, really interesting Chinese businesses that see Southeast Asia as a huge market of growth.
Yeah, I was in Indonesia for 10 days, including teaching for Georgetown University to an executive course for Indonesian officials and bankers, and also a conference with thought leaders from across ASEAN, and definitely heard that and see it every time in Southeast Asia. That's the private sector. That's Southeast Asia as a platform for Chinese EVs and consumer products and so forth. From your coverage of Xi Jinping, what do you think the strategic goal of China is in the region? It's surely more than just having a commercial platform for Chinese companies. Is it neutralizing American or Japanese influence? Is it Finlandization and actually dominating and determining outcomes? Where do you guess? You're a good correspondent, but I'm guessing you weren't so good that you were inside Zhongnanhai for the Central Military Commission
Sadly,
meeting.
no.
But what would you guess is the sort of strategic objective? Is it to make Southeast Asia choose?
Yeah, I think the phrasing of your question is really good. I think the one thing I try to remember when covering Xi Jinping is so much is a black box, and there's so much we don't know. But there's obviously ways to try to figure out or estimate what might be going on. I think the Chinese Communist Party sees Asia very much as its region, and it wants to dominate this region, with hard power, with economic power, with military power. I also think that it sees the region as a way to further its domestic ambitions. So, for example, the nickel industry in Indonesia is a really fascinating case study because, Indonesia has a lot of the world's nickel, which is a critical mineral for EVs. And for many, many years, Indonesia wanted to process its nickel. And there were all kinds of processing firms from all over the world that showed up. But the technology just really wasn't there until the Chinese showed up with this technology called HPAL. And it was all very unclear whether this Chinese tech would ultimately work. And I've spoken to people in the nickel industry in Indonesia, and they recall, visiting processing plants where there would be an enormous hole in the middle of the factory. This was a Chinese processing plant. And they would say, that would never fly in a Western plant. There would be months of delays to fix the hole and make sure all the operational standards were really up to scratch. But Chinese nickel processing firms sort of operate slightly differently. And in the end, the tech worked. And now China ultimately controls the global nickel supply chain because it's the dominant processor in Indonesia. Was that Xi Jinping's grand plan? Probably not. Did the Chinese Communist Party issue a bunch of directives saying, we want to develop and dominate the global EV supply chain? Absolutely. And those directives were then executed in all kinds of ways, including by state-owned enterprises venturing into Indonesia and really testing their technology and doing joint ventures with Indonesian firms. And I think we see that replicated across the region, where the Chinese Communist Party will set its high-level domestic priorities or identify industries that it really wants to focus on, and then those get rolled out across the party, which, has almost 100 million members. So we can get into how Xi Jinping even tries to control the party through ideology and through slogans, but that clearly filters down to something like China's policies on nickel in Indonesia.
The question in all this is how well can Southeast Asian governments or societies regulate the strategic competition? It's a cliche to say they don't want to choose. And some scholars are arguing that they are managing the competition. So, for example, when I was in Jakarta, they have a beautiful transit system, the MRT, built by Japan. But they're also working on the bullet train with China. And of course, within Indonesia, many will admit that the Japanese bullet train would have been better, but they point out we have both. When Mahathir came in Malaysia, he renegotiated some of the Belt and Road projects, got a better price by threatening to pull out. I mean, Singapore, of course, is quietly preserving its sovereignty on 5G. Vietnam's not going with China at all, but going with Samsung. So what's your sense of how well Southeast Asian countries are managing the impact of this on their sovereignty? The wild card is elite capture and corruption, which we'll get to, which is one of the topics of your recent work. But just in general, how do you think governments within the region are managing their own agency and regulating strategic competition and achieving balance? Because there is a case to be made that through Japan and others and the US, they're avoiding complete dependence. But what are you seeing in your reporting?
I think that's completely right. I mean, I think to just look at the US and China in the region is analytically misleading. There's so many other countries who are present in Southeast Asia, have been present for an incredibly long time, have really invested in the region, as you say, countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others. What I would firstly say is I've only been covering Southeast Asia for 2 years, but I've come up with a very flippant theory, which is that there's nothing really that binds Southeast Asia as a region except 3 things. That is, every country is geographically proximate on a map. 2, the food is really good everywhere. And 3, everyone believes in ghosts. And the reason I say that as sort of a joke is that there's actually something serious here, which is that every single country has a different history, a different religion, a different language, a different colonial history, different political system. Everything is so diverse here that I think to sort of try to generalize about how Southeast Asia is trying to balance the US and China is a fool's errand. And in fact, I try to think of Southeast Asia as on a spectrum. So on one end, in a way, if we're thinking about it in the context of US-China balancing, you would have the Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the US, on one end. And then on the other end, you would have countries like Cambodia and Laos, which, are really very much in China's orbit. And then in between, you have the whole range of other countries. And in a way, I think we have to look at this on a spectrum because, the Philippines' considerations when it comes to the US-China relationship are radically different from, say, Laos and Cambodia. In a way, I think there is truth to the cliche that you just mentioned, like every single country in Southeast Asia does not want to choose. And in a way, they don't have to explicitly choose. And it's much more beneficial to all of them to balance both the US and China, or actually balance China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the US. And, I think that's a very, very rational decision that they're making.
And what's your take? I mean, I'd argue it's early days, but what's your take on how the new Trump administration is shaping this competition and not having to choose thing? I mean, I find in Australia a lot of alarm, frankly, about the fate of Southeast Asia under a Trump administration. But having just spent 10 days in the region, I think it's a little more complicated than that. If you had universal tariffs, that would obviously be bad. It's not clear that will happen. It's pretty clear that the cutoff of funding for development and democracy and governance work is creating a vacuum. I could see that very clearly. The Ukraine position taken by President Trump, by J.D. Vance, is alarming Taiwan and the Philippines. On the other hand, the Indo-Pacific Command is going to get more resources. There's going to be a shift to Asia. I'm not sure that I can imagine Marcos, Prabowo, and others actually getting on quite well with President Trump compared to European leaders. So it's a bit early to make a prediction, to be honest, in my view. There's things you can see. Some of them are worrying. Some of them will have an impact, like the increasing resources for the Indo-Pacific Command. But on the ground reporting, what are some of the things you're seeing a month into the administration in terms of how the new Trump approach is shaping the dynamic we're discussing?
I think you're right that it's too early to predict, especially here in Southeast Asia. But actually, to your question, I look to what's happening domestically in China as a sort of framework to think about what then might happen in Southeast Asia, right next door. And I don't know how familiar you are with the slang in China, but, people refer to Trump as 创建国, which is the builder of our nation. And so I think there's a real sense in China that a lot of what Trump is doing is really, really good for the Chinese Communist Party and China. There's a feeling that there's a lot of own goals from the Trump administration. So I wonder if that is going to sort of ripple out into Southeast Asia, where, for example, with the departure of US AID, will China fill the gap? Will China come in and fund the programs that the US used to fund? Well, I don't know yet. I haven't done the reporting, but if I had to predict, I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility. And I think we could see that replicated in various ways. That, of course, is different from what is going to happen, in the high seas. And will the US continue to fund its military presence? Will the US continue to fund its military presence in Southeast Asia? And for that, it seems like at the moment that's the direction it's heading in. But of course, the American presence in Southeast Asia is a lot more than just its military presence.
Yeah, I think you'd have to think through what are the implications of what I think will likely be an increase in hard power and a diminishment of soft power. That's probably a little too simple, but that's kind of what we're seeing. I did hear anecdotally from people I met from the NGO world in Southeast Asia that in fact Chinese diplomats are coming in and saying, we could do that project, we could do that. And I'm not surprised that in China they're a bit giddy about on-site goals, but as the Chinese intellectual circles have a tendency to overestimate and underestimate American power. They dramatically overestimated the impact of the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 in terms of being a setback for the West and the US. They read it as the end of history and prematurely. In the Gulf War and the Iraq War, they kind of read American power as sort of much more than it was until they saw the difficulties in Iraq. So I often find, as I'm a Japan, Korea expert, but as a China watcher too, I often find that in big moments in history, our friends in Beijing tend to jump to conclusions too soon about how great or how weak American power is. But we'll see. Somebody will be right. I want to turn to the topic of your most recent reporting, which is basically about transnational crime, and your podcast series called Scam Inc., about all of the scamming networks in China, Myanmar, and Thailand. And when I was in the region, it's so extensive, and you report on it. And then maybe we can pivot into a little bit about what transnational crime, corruption, weak governance means geopolitically. But tell us a bit about Scam Inc. and what you're finding.
So when I arrived in Southeast Asia about 2 years ago, I was, traveling the region, trying to sort of get up to speed. And I was so struck, as you say, by everywhere I went, hearing that scams were one of the biggest, if not the biggest problem on the minds of ordinary people, on the minds of business, on the minds of politicians. And I thought there's something to this story. And then I started hearing about these horrific stories all over the world that were somehow connected to scams in Southeast Asia. So I pitched this 8-part podcast series. What I really wanted to look at was the rise of this incredibly sophisticated, predatory, multi-billion-dollar industry that is probably bigger now than the global illicit drug trade. So estimates are that its size is more than $500 billion every year, less than $1 trillion, and it's growing very, very rapidly. Attached to that is that we've just witnessed the biggest shift in modern history in how transnational organized crime works. So we might all be familiar with movies like The Godfather and, mafias where you've got tattooed gangsters reporting to a powerful kingpin. But what we are now seeing is these small groups in a criminal ecosystem. It's sort of like the gig economy of the underworld. So you might have one group focused on kidnapping people and trafficking them to a scam compound in Myanmar. You then have another group that's just focused on procuring American and Australian SIM cards and uploading them to phones that can be used in Myanmar in a scam compound. Then you have a third group that's just focused on one tiny part of the complex money laundering chain. And with all of these groups being able to coordinate on Telegram, the internet, various other apps, it's really, really difficult for law enforcement to do anything about it. You can't really go after the one powerful kingpin and get rid of the industry. So this very much started in China and was Chinese criminals targeting Chinese people, and then it moved into Southeast Asia. But now these criminal syndicates realize that they can actually target the whole world, and they're most interested in the rich world where they can make the most money off these scams. And so my 8-part series really traces what the rise of this industry and how destructive it has become, and also how much more terrifying it's about to be given the rise of AI and emerging technologies.
Thanks for that. We'll all sleep better now. When I was in Indonesia and I talked to foreign ministry officials about Myanmar and the challenge from the violence and implosion, I was a bit surprised, to be honest, because I thought they would say, we're worried about ASEAN credibility, worried about a vacuum in bringing in Chinese influence, worried about drugs. Every person I talked to said the thing they're most worried about is the one you're talking about, because Indonesians are doing online gambling and getting trafficked in Myanmar and disappearing. So it's not just scams, but as you noted earlier, it's trafficking. It's quite evil. What does this tell us, though? If this happened in Europe, the EU would deal with it. What does it tell us that ASEAN is incapable, because this is a region-wide problem? What does it tell us that ASEAN is incapable of dealing with this? Is it just the nature of the crime is too hard to control, or is it a bit about the shortcomings of regional, not just law enforcement, but sort of diplomatic governance? What do you think?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot wrapped up there. Yeah, so I think one thing I try to remind myself is looking in from the outside at this region, it's possible to think that it's all, every day people wake up and worry about US-China competition. But actually concerns here are much more prosaic. It's people worry about unemployment. They worry about economic growth. They worry that their salary isn't going to grow from month to month. It's a developing region. The average wage here is a couple of $100 US a month in most countries, excluding Singapore. And so you have all these incredibly talented people, many who are university graduates, many who are multilingual, who are looking for a job so that they can feed their families. And unfortunately, in many countries in Southeast Asia, there aren't that many options. And so when you have these massive criminal syndicates making upwards of $500 billion a year, there are opportunities. Obviously, a lot of people are trafficked, and that's terrible. But there are also people who opt in to this because there aren't many other job opportunities for them. So I would say that is one of the really important underlying structural problems to understand when thinking about the rise of online scams globally. And then just picking up on your other point that, the EU would deal with it, I actually think the reality is that no country in the world right now has the ability to deal with the global rise of online scams. So in Scam Inc., I look at Singapore, which arguably has the world's best response to grappling with online scams, especially because so many Singaporeans have lost so much money. And they've developed this anti-scam center where they have the police sitting in the same room as banks and as e-commerce platforms. And their thinking is, we don't begin to tackle this problem until we acknowledge that there's a whole scam chain, because a criminal will often start out using an internet service provider or a telcos firm to start a scam. Then they'll move to a social media app, a messaging app, an e-commerce platform to execute the scam, which means that then the banks and the cryptocurrency exchanges get involved. And it's only after the victim has sent all their money that they might report it to the police. So to just tackle it from, say, law enforcement really isn't enough. But even Singapore, which has a much more progressive policy towards this, is seeing the number of victims every half year go up. So I actually think, yes, perhaps the EU doesn't have as much of a human trafficking problem, although we've now seen reports of scam compounds popping up in Europe, including in the Isle of Man between England and Ireland. But I think from a law enforcement perspective of how do we protect victims from losing their life savings to these criminal syndicates, neither ASEAN nor the EU really has it under control.
Right, I got it. It's not that ASEAN is particularly feckless or weak. It's just even the most advanced governments like Singapore are struggling with this because of the sophisticated nature of the criminals and stand by eventually AI, which will make them even harder to control and track down. So I get that it's a state failing. What about opportunities for interstate cooperation? Is this coming back a bit to our geopolitics? It seems to me a lot of these criminals, you said, started in China. Is this an area where China can help itself and the region by leading on a crackdown, or is that just not in the nature of how the Chinese system works? Is it an area where the Australian Federal Police, which actually is pretty good on online, certainly on the dark web, the AFP have been, and Home Affairs in Australia have been as effective as anyone in finding criminals? Is there a role for the AFP, the FBI? Is this going to be an arena where China exerts influence, perhaps helpful, where the US or Australia or others have a role to play? How do you see this playing out on the international stage?
Yeah, I think absolutely that there is a role for everyone. And this genuinely is a crisis. These criminal syndicates are stealing so much money every year, and as a result are able to reinvest in their quote unquote businesses and buy the latest and best technology, bribe all kinds of officials from low-level police officers on the Thai-Myanmar border up to elite-level politicians at the highest level of government. So we absolutely need to be coordinating across countries, across regions. To your question on the role of China, you're right. So when Xi Jinping launched his signature anti-corruption crackdown, it swept the country, including Macau, where a lot of these criminal syndicates can trace their roots. And there's a big overlap between online gambling and online scams. And so these criminals were pushed out into Southeast Asia. And initially they were focused on building up their online gambling businesses as a replacement for their gambling businesses in Macau. But soon they realized the back-end technology for online gambling is very similar to the back-end technology for running online scams. And that was when they pivoted to another business line. And these syndicates are very rational as well. You know, they're not just doing online scams. They're doing all kinds of criminal activities, prostitution, drugs, online gambling, often drug smuggling, illegal wildlife trafficking. And so scams were really just their latest business line. And initially they were targeting mainland Chinese until the Chinese Communist Party really realized this was a major problem and ran aggressive public education campaigns. You know, there's a whole genre of movies in China about the scam industry. And so these criminals started focusing on other markets. And that's why this now is really a global problem. But the point is that there's no country in the whole world that better understands the scale and the sophistication of these criminal syndicates, which are often of Chinese origin, than China. So, you know, if we want to deal with this, I think it's really, really important that we understand that and then think about whether there are ways to work with China on fighting this. And in fact, I would argue this is one of the few spots of cooperation that could genuinely be possible given the broader geopolitical environment right now.
You know, I worked in the White House as the senior Asia official under President Bush, and in a different era, this would have been an area where we proactively reached out to Beijing and maybe Singapore and others to start working on solutions. That's not the environment we're in politically in the US or China. I think China would rebuff that. You could see a little bit in the way the US struggled to get Chinese help on fentanyl, for example. But it also occurs to me, you're looking at the increased Chinese presence, but are you seeing any role for China in capacity building and helping governments deal with this? I mean, they've cleaned it up at home to some extent. They've exported the problem, perhaps unintentionally, to Southeast Asia. But do you see Chinese efforts to actually help countries in the region deal with this, given what you said about China being sort of the epicenter and most experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think this is one of the really, really important developments right now in Southeast Asia. So in January, China convened a very, very rare meeting in Kunming in Yunnan. Many Southeast Asian countries were there, and the meeting was all about focusing on this crackdown on online scams. And over the past few weeks, we've seen a whole range of news stories come out about the results of that meeting. So, there were joint operations on the Thai-Myanmar border where thousands of people were pulled out of scam compounds in Myanmar. We've seen Thailand cut off the electricity supply to these scam compounds in Myanmar ahead of Ung Eng's visit to Beijing. We've seen Cambodia launch its own sort of anti-scam commission headed up by Hun Manet, and plans for more joint cooperation between Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. So there's a lot happening in the region, and I think what is the really important for understanding what we're seeing is that China's most pressing problem in Southeast Asia right now is online scams. And it is doing everything it can to try to pressure countries in Southeast Asia to do something about it. Now, the big question is whether that's possible, given the extent to which these scam networks have infiltrated the highest levels of politics and government across many countries in Southeast Asia.
Beijing is putting pressure on these countries to deal with the online gambling and other scams that affect China and Chinese citizens. But do you see the kind of capacity building, helping police or governments or NGOs or others develop, sovereign capabilities within Thailand or Cambodia? In other words, is China doing what the US and Australia and others did after 9/11, pressuring countries, yes, but also helping them develop counterterrorism capabilities of their own? Do you see that kind of effort coming from Beijing, or is it mainly deal with the problem so it doesn't affect us?
I think a lot of this is being driven by the fact that this is a huge domestic problem in China. And so a lot of the policy pushes we're seeing are, let's deal with this problem so it doesn't affect us. I'm not sure the extent to which you've got Chinese police training Thai police or Cambodian police. I know that there have been joint operations done together, but often governments are incredibly cagey about it because it's very sensitive, and local people in Southeast Asia don't like the idea that China could be trampling on the sovereignty of other countries. So the official language around what is happening right now can be quite fuzzy, I've noticed. But absolutely there's information sharing going on based on what my sources have told me. And I think we should expect there'll be more and more cooperation in lots of different forms going forward. But I think the big question is whether any of this is going to be enough. And I worry it's not.
Yeah. It also opens a huge opportunity, if not responsibility, for the US, Australia, Europe, Japan, to do what I'm describing, to actually can provide expertise, training, technology. I don't think most people in capital, in Washington, Canberra, and Tokyo, realize how massive this is and actually the geopolitical implications. It's great you're calling attention to it.
Can I just add to that? I think it would be really, really good if we saw more of that in the region. And actually, from what I've heard, scams have now become the number one crime in many countries in the rich world. The problem is it's often not picked up in the data because so many people don't report it out of shame or denial. And then even if they do try and report it, often systems can't pick it up. Like there's no category for these kinds of scams in reporting. One country that is really doing a lot of reporting is Singapore, and the data shows that scams have now overtaken traditional crimes like theft to become the number one crime in Singapore. So I don't think it'd be unreasonable to expect that that is the same in other countries. The issue is that for a lot of law enforcement, they just don't really have the tools to deal with this problem because there's still this traditional I'm fighting street crime mentality at local police stations and in police forces. So even if countries like America, Australia, Japan, South Korea were to do capacity building in Southeast Asia, I worry that they haven't yet developed the tools themselves in their home countries to deal with the rise of online scams. So I'm not sure whether they would really be in a position to be training police forces in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I think it's to be seen. I know from personal experience that Australian banks and US banks are becoming extremely skilled. Maybe not as much as they have to be, but extremely skilled at detecting, preventing, and quickly remedying online scams. A lot of people have probably experienced that, unfortunately. And the capability of, I won't mention names, but US and Australian banks is quite good. So as you mentioned, this is the Singaporean way is bankers and police sitting together. And there's going to be a lot that the West, that the US, the EU, Japan, Australia, and others have to offer if people think of it as an important part of our diplomatic toolkit.
But do these banks have the capacity to, say, clamp down on scam compounds and those criminal syndicates?
That's probably, yeah, I don't think a bunch of bankers are going to drop out of helicopters. But in terms of defense of the consumer and so forth, they are rapidly developing capabilities. And I do think for the FBI, for the AFP, this is growing as a priority. I wanted to conclude by just talking a little bit about corruption. I mean, democracy is a mixed picture in Asia. They had more people vote than ever before in history around the world and in the region. But I think in a lot of countries, corruption is actually getting worse. And you mentioned that one reason these scammers have been able to develop these empires is because they can bribe right up to the top. What you're thinking about that? In Australia, there's a term that others are now adopting, elite capture, which is a polite way of saying that China or other nefarious actors like criminal syndicates can bribe their way to the top and get what they want. And so accountability, anti-corruption, it seems to me that's not an immediate fix, but that's also a really important part of this problem.
Absolutely. And I think at the heart of this problem is it's not just that there are so many talented young people in developing countries who are looking for jobs. There's another important piece of the puzzle, which is corruption. And, as long as there's systemic corruption and these criminal syndicates can pay off people up and down the bureaucracy in these countries, it's going to be very, very difficult to get rid of these scam compounds. So the United States Institute of Peace estimates that the size of Cambodia's scamming economy is roughly half of Cambodia's GDP every year. And then in Laos, it's about 40%. So there are countries in Southeast Asia that are becoming or have become scam states. In the 1990s, we heard about the rise of narco states in Latin America. Well, this is the age of the scam state, where every single part of the country's bureaucracy is being infiltrated by these criminal syndicates, such that the whole country is turning into a scam state, so reliant on not just the scam compounds, but all the secondary industries that sort of supply the scam compounds, whether it's food and beverage or hotels or hairdressers. And so that also makes this such a wicked problem, because how do governments clamp down on something that's providing so much economic growth in their country?
Well, Sue-Lin, thank you for the insights. It's a fascinating and disturbing intersection of geopolitics, transnational crime, governance and democracy, and business. And for people who want to learn more, what should they do? Read The Economist, follow your podcast?
Yeah, you can listen to Scam Inc. wherever you get your podcasts.
All right. I think many will. Sue-Lin, many, many thanks. Appreciate you spending the time with us.
Thanks so much, Mike.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.